birth of Catholicism in America has everything to do with the arrival of the Europeans. I believe that the Europeans, they saw a need to bring Catholicism here, not just to save the souls, but also to further their own goals in establishing their own presence there. They have undoubtedly left an influence. The Hispanic presence has survived. And through their presence, Catholicism has survived, because it's a very important part to a lot of the traditional Hispanic identity. You know, Spain, going all the way back to the very earliest history, it was eventually conquered by the Roman Empire. And then when the Roman Empire was evangelized and the persecutions of the Christians eventually stopped, it became the faith of the empire. And so Spain, as a former part of the Roman Empire, eventually also adopted the Catholic faith from very, very early on. Wherever the Spanish go, Catholicism will go with them. And since they were the very first ones to come here to the New World, since in 1492, Christopher Columbus came and he established the first Spanish presence in the New World. And eventually, little by little, it started to grow, and there were more Spaniards founding settlements all across the New World. Catholicism came with them.
When Pope Francis came to the United States back in 2015 to canonize Junipero Serra, he made a reference to St. Junipero's own motto, which actually comes from his, kind of how he signed off his letter to his parents, Siempre Adelante, ever forward. A big thing that Pope Francis, why Junipero Serra needs to be canonized, is to remind Americans that U.S. history is not just from the Puritan, Pilgrim perspective. Even though that's been the most influential in our textbooks, that's been stressed generation after generation. It's like, what about the Spanish presence and the Catholic history of the United States?
So the very first Spaniard to come to the southeast region was Juan Ponce de Leon. He was the first governor of Puerto Rico, and from Puerto Rico is where he eventually makes his way to discover Florida. And he discovered it during the Lenten season, and he gave it its name, La Florida, as it's called. And from then on, that discovery opened up a Pandora's box. It started a domino effect, because a lot of other explorers started coming after him, trying to go to that region to search for it for many purposes: gold, slavery, everything. And then later we get Hernando de Soto in 1539. He makes it to Tampa Bay, and he makes his way inland into the Appalachian lands, into Anhaica, Appalachia. Eventually he makes his way further north, and then he ultimately dies somewhere along the Mississippi River, and that's the end of that. And there are also battles that happened during the time of the Soto expedition, most notably the Battle of Mavila, which happened in what's today Alabama. That happened there during that expedition, involving local Native American tribes. And then after that point, this is when we get the first documented missionary effort that involved a martyr. And this was Fray Luis Cáncer de Barbastro. And he had some successes in the New World, in South America, with the Maya. And he was brought in precisely because the early expeditions to La Florida were failures. A lot of the Spanish authorities were very hesitant about sending other missionaries to that region, because it was seen as like the unconquerable region. But this man had successes amongst the Maya, and they decided to give him a chance, and he eventually made his way to the Tampa Bay region, although he would not succeed, because in June of 1549, he would be clubbed to death on the shores of Tampa Bay. And he became the first proto-martyr of Florida, of the Southeast. So up to that point, there was no success. There were some early missionary efforts in that region, but they did not succeed. Ultimately, however, that would change in the 1560s with the arrival of French Protestants on the coast of South Carolina and Florida. They had two settlements. They had Charles Fort at what's today Santa Elena on Paris Island, and then they also had Fort de la Caroline on what's near the Jacksonville region. And so when the Spanish ultimately noted that they had a French Protestant presence in lands that they claimed for the crown, that was a big problem. This was following the Protestant Reformation, so there was a lot of tensions in Europe, and particularly between French Protestants, French Catholics, and all of Catholic Europe and all of Protestant Europe. And so a small little episode of the Protestant Reformation played out here in the Southeast. And that would ultimately culminate with the founding of St. Augustine, because when St. Augustine was founded, Pedro Menendez de Avilés, he kicked those French Protestants out of the southeast. And this involved a lot of violence. There was a massacre at what's today Matanzas Inlet, and there was also a massacre at Fort Caroline. And after that, that's when St. Augustine was discovered. It was named after St. Augustine of Hippo because they sighted land on his feast day. And that's why they named the new settlement San Agustin, St. Augustine. And then from St. Augustine is where we get the very first successfully documented missions in the southeast.
So in Georgia history, right, you had the explorers, Ponce de Leon and so on, going up the coast, and cartographers doing maps and so on. California, on the other hand, for a lot of its history, they actually thought it was an island, right, going back to the 1500s. So you had Balboa, you had Cabrillo, you had Vizcaíno. Those guys doing it a little later in the 1500s and early 1600s. And their maps went into an archives back in Madrid, in Mexico City. And then what happened was people were talking. The British were starting to, or at least from a Spanish perspective, they felt that the British were intruding on their traditional lands.
The Spanish, through their connections with a lot of the local Timucua that lived in what's today St. Augustine. Their very first mission was Nombre de Dios mission, established in what's today St. Augustine. At the time, it was just part of a Timucua village. It was a village called Saloy, and Saloy was where St. Augustine was born. And so from there, through those connections, they began to look northward. And the Timucua also had lands in what's today Fort George Island and Amelia Island. And they also set their eyes further north towards the lands of the Guale. And the Guale, once today the coastal region of Georgia, in 1566, Menendez visited the main village of the chief of Guale. And at that point is when we start seeing the birth of the mission of Santa Catalina de Guale. And from that point on, you see a Jesuit presence being established in a lot of these early missions. Ultimately, however, it would not last very long because the Jesuits just had no success whatsoever with these early Native American tribes. And you could really see that it came to a boiling point in 1570 when they even established a mission up in Virginia on the James Peninsula. And ultimately, they brought forth a Native American named Paquiquinio, but he ultimately turned his back on them and he went back to his original tribe, and all the missionaries, except for one small boy, Aloncito de Olmos, was killed. But after that martyrdom, obviously the Spanish crown saw that there was no success with the Jesuits, so the Jesuits were pulled from all of those missions. They were eventually replaced by the Franciscans, and the Franciscans had much more success. And that's where you start seeing in the 1570s, a lot of missions started to be born. You had Santa Catalina de Guale on what's St. Catherine's Island, and you started seeing a lot of other missions being formed on the coast of Georgia. But the problem was that you were dealing with Native Americans that didn't live the same way that the Europeans and the European Catholics did. So there was a lot of tensions. The Catholics would obviously tell them you had to give up a lot of the early pagan rituals, you had to give up a lot of your early traditions, and that was not going to be something they were going to take very easily. And so by the 1590s, this is where you start to see that a lot of those tensions began to come to a boiling point again. And that's where you had in September 1597, you had the Guale revolt. And that led to the massacre of multiple friars at the mission of Santa Catalina de Guale, at Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe de Tolomato, Santa Clara de Tupiqui. And then you also had, of course, Father de Avila, who was the only one to survive. And you also had Father Francisco de Veracola, who was also martyred as well. St. Catherine, Santa Catalina de Guale, that mission lasted past the 1597 revolt. It was ultimately rebuilt. And for quite a long time, it operated without a problem. But of course, now the British presence up in Virginia became a problem. So in 1607, you see the founding of Jamestown. And from there, the British began aligning themselves with a lot of the local Virginian Native American tribes. Beginning in the 1650s, you started seeing the Chichimeco or Westo warriors raiding all of these settlements where the Spanish missions were. And in the 1660s, they also attacked the Guale region, and there would be more raids, and they'd have to then send all of those inhabitants further south to Florida And they eventually settled at Harrison Creek in Amelia Island. And that's where they stood until Queen Anne's War broke out. And that's when Colonel Moore and the Carolinians invaded Amelia Island in November of 1702, and that provoked them to flee. And really, during Queen Anne's War, that's when the missions start to really move closer to St. Augustine. Most of them were abandoned, but Santa Catalina de Iguale actually moved to Nombre de Dios, and that's where it would disappear. That would be the last place where it would stand. So by the time that Florida passed to the British in 1763, there were only 2 missions, if I recall, in St. Augustine, and that's where they all ended up. It was Talamado and Nombre de Dios. And where Talamado was is now the Talamado Cemetery. And Nombre de Dios as well. It's still it's a shrine today, and it's still a Catholic place of worship. But the missions ultimately, after Queen Anne's War, that was, I believe, the end.
In Baja California, in modern Mexico, that state, the Jesuits were there, and they had set up missions going back to the early 1600s. And during the suppression of the Jesuit order, that was like the last part in the Spanish Empire that the Jesuits were removed back to Europe because of the whole socio-political environment surrounding the Society of Jesus. And who took over for them? The Franciscans. So Junipero Serra was made the father president of the missions first and foremost in Baja California. And he's only there for about a year. And then he was given the okay by the governor general to go on a spiritual conquest of what was then known as New California, Nueva California, which will eventually be known as Alta California in the modern state of California today. So in California mission history, the Spaniards were there roughly for about 50 years, only 50 years. And I want to say about 140, I think to be precise, 142 Franciscan friars were there at one time or another, serving the missions and the mission Indians. Out of that, unlike the Spanish here in Georgia and Florida, one was martyred. In terms of the Spanish soldiers, you had roughly 5 or 6 at each mission. And you had sometimes 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 mission Indians connected to the mission itself. So I think that's another example of like, well, if it was really, really bad, sometimes people like to equate them, I think totally incorrectly, as slave plantations, then they could have, I think, rose up very easily, which they did early on at certain places like Mission San Diego, where Friar Jaime was martyred. There's evidence also of mission Indians eating 3 square meals a day. There's evidence to show that they were actually working 6 hours a day, 6 hours a day. So all these disparaging claims of like slave plantations and so on, the historical record seems to show it doesn't quite look that way. There's verifiable evidence that the Spanish soldiers mistreated natives on occasion. So the natives and native allies who sometimes speak out against the mission history, they throw the word genocide around a lot, but it's cultural genocide. Unfortunately, with life, disease did spread, and that's really unfortunate. And there are examples of abuse from a modern mindset, which we would totally frown upon, corporal punishment. But back then it was very standard. Oftentimes when people look at history, sometimes they want to see the history that they want for their own perspective or to support their own bias possibly, right? But there's great evidence that Junipero Serra loved the natives. He wanted nothing more than to bring the gospel to them. When he was in Baja California making his way to what is today San Diego for the first time, in his diary he writes, we saw our first natives as if they were from the Garden of Eden. They're running around naked. And he was so excited to bring the gospel to them. And he went all the way to Mexico City, all the way from Monterey in Mission Carmel to the Viceroy, who was the king's representative in New Spain, to say, hey, The priests need to be in charge of the discipline of the mission Indians, not the military. Serra did say, hey, you know what, corporal punishment's okay as a last resort, kind of to make a point to the others. It's pretty complex stuff, but I think what it boils down to is, for Junipero Serra, is guilt by association with colonialism and the bad aspects of colonialism.
The biggest mistake that a lot of the critics make is assuming that all of these conversions were forced. They were not. Actually, the evidence shows that there was a lot of conversions that were genuine, particularly among like the Timucua and among the Apalachee. You saw that a lot of them adopted the Catholic faith, particularly if they were young. If they were older, there was a little bit more resistance and reluctance for them to effectively be evangelized. But a lot of the efforts were done towards the children, because the children are the ones that will ultimately assimilate all of that, since they're in the age of assimilation. And a lot of that you could see in the stories of a lot of the early martyrs. There were also a lot of Native Americans that participated and served as effective evangelists. And one of my favorite ones, actually there's two that I think have the most fascinating stories, and they were both Native Americans. The first one was Antonio Cuipa. He was born in Mission San Luis de Talimali of Apalachee parentage, and he was an Inija. He was the second in command. And he used to sing songs, and he used to talk of how beautiful his faith was. I mean, he was an effectively evangelized Apalachee Native American who adopted Catholicism, grew up on the Spanish missions, and he loved his faith. But to say that this was a forced conversion, no, his parents adopted Catholicism as well. And they passed that example on to him. And Antonio Cuipa ultimately died at the mission of Ayubale during Queen Anne's War, and he became a martyr for his faith. He didn't want to give up his faith. And the other one is Joseph the Sacristan. And he was at Mission Nombre de Dios Chiquito, and he was serving at the chapel of Our Lady of La Leche. And when the Colonel Palmer raids came in St. Augustine, and he immediately saw that they were coming this way, the first thing he did was try to save the Holy Host, the Holy Eucharist. Like, he didn't want that to be desecrated in the most horrible way, because it's the true presence of our Lord Jesus Christ. And he was clutching to the Eucharist when he was running from the chapel, and ultimately he was killed. And so that is also an example. A Native American like Joseph, if he was forced to do this, why would he die for a faith that he didn't believe in? Ultimately, the great point here is, if they were forced into this, then why would they die for it? It's very easy to broadly paint the whole Spanish mission period, east or west, with this idea that they were just trying to force Catholicism on the Native Americans. That's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows is that a lot of them genuinely adopted it. Was there resistance? Yeah, especially in the Southeast. There were many revolts. That's expected, because Catholicism preaches repentance. It preaches a change in lifestyle. And that, to a lot of the Native Americans who never heard that, that's a little bit extreme. So it's expected that some of them would not adopt that, some of them would not agree with that. But again, why would they die for a faith that it's not native to their culture if they were forced to believe in it? It doesn't make any sense, in my opinion.
So there are really two types of histories going on. One, the kind of idea of settling and then evangelizing under the protection of the military in some capacity. But then you also have the mission time itself. So in California, eventually there's 21. 9 were set up during St. Junipero Serra when he was the father president. His successor will be Father Lesuen. He was from the Basque country in Spain, and he would set up another 10 during his time.
The California mission, the reason that they still stand to this day, the vast majority of them, is because of the time. Yeah, they came in the 1700s, they came a little bit closer to today's era. Whereas the ones in the Southeast, they were established beginning in the 1560s. And by the end of the 1600s, political tensions between two major empires of the time ultimately made that impossible to sustain. And so Great Britain got very powerful, influential. They built their colonies further south. They built Charlestown in 1670, they built Savannah in 1733. So obviously, political tensions played a role. And that played a role of why a lot of those missions were very unknown to most people. So and of course, when you talk to your average American and you ask about Spanish missions, the first thing they'll think is California, of course, because it's identified with California. The East Coast missions, they had to use the materials they had around them. So they had to use palm thatch roofing, they had to use wattle and daub construction techniques. But in Georgia and the Carolinas, it's become very unknown. As of recently, I am seeing there's a lot more interest in that period. For example, the dig on St. Catherine's Island, that's a miracle because they were having trouble. Before that, there were many people trying to locate that mission on St. Catherine's Island, and they were not successful. So the fact that they managed to find that little mission site on this little part of the island was a miracle in of itself, because now that's another location that we now know that we can document. And we now know where, more or less, after the 1597 revolt, where that mission was located. So by the 1600s, it was at that Wamasi Head site where it is today. And thanks to the archaeologists over there, they've really been able to document a lot of the work and a little bit of how the Native American Guala lived in that mission. And you're also able to see more or less what the church looked like, what the friary looked like, what the kitchen looked like. You knew where the plaza was. So they had an idea of what the mission looked like. Because before that, we could just rely on written documentation, but it didn't tell you 100% where it was located. But now we do know where it was located. So little by little, I think we're kind of getting there. We're seeing more and more information coming to light of that time period.
You really have to look at the history in stages. When people make these kind of blanket statements about Catholic history in California, I don't think they're really aware that you need to look at the Spanish, which is only about 50 years, and then the Mexicans come in. New Mexico becomes independent through revolution and so on, and they're there for a short time too, and then the Americans come in. So there's almost different parts, different histories in terms of the relations with the natives. So when the Mexicans do take over, historians say probably about 10 to 14% during that time of transition ran off and they didn't want to come back. And the soldiers would, they'd try to get them back by word of mouth first, but if they didn't, they'd try to bring them by force, which is really unfortunate. During Junipero Serra's time is more like asking your boss for vacation time and that you're going to come back. When Mexico takes over, the idea, the Mexicans were really, really big on freeing the Mission Indians from the tyranny of the friars and all that stuff. And when the Spanish kind of said, hey, we're out of here, let's go back to Mexico City, and then they were kicked out and sent back to Spain, the Mission Indians were like, what do we do now? This is our home. We're Catholic, we love it, we love it. They didn't know what to do. And they basically became serfs for the Mexicans who took over. So what happens is the United States comes in, and California was kind of in need of a history. And where do they find the history? In the California missions of the Spanish times. But it wasn't all, here come the friars bringing Western civilization and the natives, just lining up. Oh, this is great, right? They lined up for many different reasons. One, for the protection of the Spanish soldiers from their traditional enemies. Two, for that food source that I share with you, like 3 square meals a day, but also for the gospel message. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was in Cincinnati at the Tequaquita conference, and I gave a presentation on Pablo Talk, that first Native American seminarian from the California Mission Indians. He went all the way to Rome. He wrote the language of his people, the history of the natives of Southern California. He's a young boy. He's like a teenager. And he got really close to being ordained too, but he died of disease back in Rome during his studies. And why I'm bringing this up is the people that I was speaking to, the Tequaquita conference, Catholic Native Americans, the most Catholic, faith-filled people I ever met, and happy. They love that the gospel message was brought to them. Yes, there have been difficulties historically and so on with the institutional church, sometimes how the gospel message was brought and so on, but they love the Catholic faith. So that was a real great shot in the arm for me, because I didn't know how they were going to react because of my being such an advocate for the reputation of Junipero Serra. And they're like, no, this is great. We love the Catholic faith and so on. So that was really inspirational to me.
While the early Spanish mission period failed, Catholicism did not die here. It kept its presence here. And no matter what persecutions it sustained throughout its long history, it's still here. And it's still living, and it's still very strong.
Well, it's a living faith, right? It's a living faith, and to be rooted and know about the struggles and challenges and joys and aspirations and successes of Catholics in the past can help us in our toolbox today to help us persevere in evangelizing and being witnesses to Christ in our day-to-day living.